Morning light filtered through the tall windows of Ellison County Courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Each footstep echoed like a distant memory. In that solemn chamber, a black woman named Janelle Moore sat quietly at the defendant's table. Her crisp white blouse contrasted with her deep brown skin, and her neatly braided hair framed a face of quiet strength. Her eyes scanned the room with the precision of someone trained to read every detail, every breath, every twitch. To the crowd, she was just another name in a courtroom. Just another defendant in another case of resisting arrest. The accuser was Officer Derek Collins, a white policeman whose uniform was sharp and his demeanor even sharper. He claimed Janelle had become aggressive, refused to identify herself, and even tried to grab his weapon. His words painted her as a threat. Sitting beside Janelle was her young lawyer, Caleb Rhodes, fresh out of law school, visibly nervous, clutching his notes like they were his only shield. He looked at her, hoping for reassurance. But Janelle didn't look back. She kept her gaze forward, calm, unshaken. When the bailiff called out, "State of Georgia versus Janelle Moore," the room stirred. Curious glances turned toward her, some skeptical, others dismissive. But none of them knew the truth. Janelle was no ordinary woman. She had fought battles most would never understand. She had defended freedom overseas, and now she was preparing for one more battle, this time on her own soil. Judge Ronald Whitmore, a seasoned man with thinning silver hair and a voice that once carried the weight of a gavel like thunder, took his seat on the bench. Though his face appeared calm, there was a flicker of curiosity behind his tired eyes, perhaps stirred by the unusually large crowd, or by the defendant's unwavering posture in the face of serious charges. Across the aisle, Officer Derek Collins leaned back in his chair, wearing a faint smirk as if victory was already assured. The uniform he wore wasn't just fabric. It was a symbol of authority that, for too long, had gone unquestioned. "Officer Collins," the judge began, "you may take the stand." Collins rose, his movements rehearsed. He adjusted his belt, tugged at his sleeves, and gave a quick glance toward Janelle. That smirk again, this time with the confidence of a man who believed his word would never be challenged. With a steady voice, Collins recounted the night. "I was responding to a report of suspicious behavior near Jefferson and Elm. That's where I saw the defendant loitering outside a closed business. When I asked what she was doing, she immediately became hostile. She refused to provide ID, raised her voice, and when I tried to calm her down, she struck me hard in the chest and reached for my service weapon." Gasps filled the room. Several people turned to stare at Janelle, expecting a reaction. But she sat still, unmoved, her expression unreadable. Her lawyer, Caleb, shifted uncomfortably, his fingers trembling as he wrote notes. But Janelle leaned over, whispering with calm clarity, "Stay with the facts. Don't let the noise distract you." The prosecution rested its case shortly after. Collins walked off the stand with the swagger of a man convinced of his invincibility. He exchanged knowing glances with fellow officers sitting in the back row, men who had stood by him for years, unquestioning, unwavering. Then came the moment the entire courtroom had been waiting for. "Miss Moore," the judge said, his voice cautious, "you may take the stand." Janelle stood slowly, brushing a non-existent crease from her blouse. As she walked to the witness stand, the room quieted. Every breath seemed to pause. When the prosecutor leaned in, his voice laced with cynicism, "Miss Moore, can you explain your behavior that night?" She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned into the microphone, her voice calm but sharp. "Before I explain anything," she said, "I want to make one thing clear. What Officer Collins said is not only inaccurate, it's a lie." A collective gasp swept through the room. The prosecutor scoffed, but Judge Whitmore didn't stop her. Janelle looked straight ahead, not at the jury, not at her lawyer, but at the truth. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the truth doesn't shout. It just waits. And when it arrives, it changes everything." The air inside the courtroom was thick, like a thunderstorm just moments away. Every gaze locked on Janelle Moore as she sat at the witness stand, posture straight, voice steady. She didn't yell. She didn't plead. She simply spoke, clearly, truthfully. "That night," she began, "I wasn't loitering. I wasn't trespassing. I was simply checking my phone for directions after leaving a friend's house. I wasn't a threat. I wasn't aggressive. I was just existing." The prosecutor leaned forward. "Are you saying Officer Collins fabricated the entire event?" "I'm saying he abused his authority," Janelle replied, unblinking. He approached me with aggression, grabbed my arm when I questioned his motive, and slammed me against the patrol car when I told him I hadn't done anything wrong. There was a moment of stunned silence before murmurs spread like wildfire through the gallery. The judge pounded his gavel. Order. Then came the turning point. Janelle's lawyer, Caleb Rhodes, stood slowly, a USB drive in hand. Your Honor, he said, his voice firm, the defense would like to submit video evidence, recorded by a witness during the arrest. The room froze. Even Officer Collins's smug expression faltered. The video flickered to life on the courtroom screen. Though shaky, the footage clearly showed Officer Collins gripping Janelle's arm. Her voice was audible, calm but assertive. I'm not resisting. Let go of me. Then came Collins's voice. Women like you don't get to question me. The gallery erupted. Gasps, curses, disbelief. Judge Whitmore slammed his gavel repeatedly. Order. But the damage was done. The prosecutor scrambled. This footage lacks full context. Janelle didn't wait. She leaned into the microphone once more. I told him I didn't consent to being touched. I told him to let go. Instead, he used his badge as a weapon. And then he lied under oath to justify it. Caleb approached the bench again. We also request to submit Exhibit B, Officer Collins's disciplinary file. 5 prior complaints. Excessive force. Racial bias. All buried. The judge reviewed the file in silence. His expression darkened. Officer Collins, he said, voice low and dangerous, you may want to retain counsel. Collins's hands began to tremble. Caleb turned to Janelle. There's one more thing you haven't told them, he whispered. Janelle stood. Her gaze swept across the room. She took a slow breath. I am Lieutenant Commander Janelle Moore, retired Navy SEAL, she said, her voice slicing through the silence. I've spent 20 years defending this country in places most people can't even pronounce. I know what a threat looks like. And Officer Collins was not afraid. He was in control. And he used that control to humiliate me. Gasps filled the room again, this time tinged with awe. People like me, she continued, don't get the benefit of the doubt. We get the full weight of suspicion, even when we spend our lives fighting for freedom. The courtroom was silent now, eerily still. Janelle stepped down from the witness stand, her chin held high, her steps measured. And in that moment, even the people who came expecting a criminal now saw what she truly was. Not a defendant, not a threat, but a warrior. The silence in the courtroom was unlike anything that had come before it, not the awkward kind, not the polite kind, but the kind that follows revelation. The kind that weighs heavy in the air, as if the truth itself had settled on every shoulder in the room. Officer Derek Collins returned to his seat like a man walking toward the edge of a cliff. Gone was the smirk. Gone was the confidence. All that remained was a pale face and clenched fists, his knuckles white against the polished wood of the plaintiff's table. His fellow officers, once a wall of silent support in the back row, now exchanged glances, their eyes unsure, their posture slouched. The unbreakable wall was beginning to crumble. Judge Ronald Whitmore leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, his voice suddenly low and deliberate. Mr. Carter, he said to the defense, do you have any final evidence to present? Caleb Rhodes stood slowly, a final folder in hand. Yes, Your Honor. What we present next speaks not just to this case, but to a pattern. He handed out copies of Collins's disciplinary record to the jury, complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, unprofessional behavior. Many had been internally dismissed, buried, forgotten. Not today. The prosecutor objected, but the judge waved it off. The jury will review. The murmurs returned. Louder now. People in the gallery whispered, brows furrowed, faces full of disgust. Back at the defense table, Janelle sat motionless, hands folded, her calm presence holding more power than any raised voice. Her silence spoke volumes. She had already said what needed to be said. Now it was the system's turn to answer. In a quiet moment between presentations, Caleb leaned toward her. You just changed everything, he whispered. Janelle replied softly, without turning her head. No, I just refused to be erased. Outside, the news had already broken. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps. Twitter trended with hashtag Lieutenant Moore, hashtag Truth in Uniform, and hashtag Justice for Janelle. Inside, the jury requested time to deliberate. Though from their expressions, Many already knew where they stood. As they exited, Judge Whitmore issued a chilling statement. Let this court make something clear. This is not just a question of guilt or innocence. It is a question of character, of accountability, and of trust. And if that trust is broken, this courtroom will not be the last to feel the consequences. The recess was granted. The room emptied in uneasy silence. On the courthouse steps, Janelle paused. The crowd parted like water as she walked through, some with phones raised, others simply watching, wide-eyed. A woman reached out and gently touched Janelle's hand. "Thank you," she whispered, voice cracking. Janelle nodded. "This isn't just my story," she said quietly. "It belongs to all of us who were told to sit down, to stay silent, to be afraid." Behind her, Officer Collins remained seated inside the courtroom, now flanked not by support, but by doubt. The tide had turned, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The jury returned just after sunset. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, every aisle lined with silent observers, their eyes trained on the 12 individuals whose decision now carried the weight of truth and consequence. Reporters clutched notepads, camera shutters clicked in bursts, and behind the defendant's table, Janelle Moore stood tall, shoulders square, eyes steady, heart quiet. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and the calm resolve of someone who had felt every word in that courtroom, rose. "In the case of the state versus Janelle Moore," she began, unfolding the verdict slip with deliberate care, "we find the defendant not guilty on all charges." Gasps broke through the stillness, followed by the soft sound of restrained applause before Judge Whitmore raised his gavel. Even he, for a fleeting second, let something shift in his eyes, a quiet respect, hard-earned and deeply felt. The foreperson continued. "We further recommend a formal investigation into the conduct of Officer Derek Collins." Across the room, Collins sank in his seat. He looked smaller now, like the air had left his body. His once confident hands now trembled as the judge turned to him with an expression that could only be described as final. "This court takes that recommendation seriously," the judge said gravely. "Officer Collins, I suggest you retain legal counsel. Your actions may have violated not only the trust of this community, but the very oath you swore to uphold." A slow exhale escaped from Caleb, Janelle's lawyer. He looked at her, overwhelmed. "You did it," he whispered. "No," Janelle said softly, her voice almost a prayer. "The truth did." Outside, a sea of people had gathered. When Janelle stepped out, they stood in silence, not because they were unsure of what to say, but because they understood something sacred had just happened. She faced the microphones and cameras, not for fame, but because some messages are too important to leave unsaid. "This isn't just a victory for me," she said, voice steady, carrying across the crowd. "It's a message for every person who has ever been silenced, profiled, or punished for daring to exist in their own skin." She paused, holding up a folded flag, the same one that had sat on her mantle through 20 years of sacrifice. "I served my country because I believed in justice. But today, I had to fight for it at home. This verdict is not the end. It's a beginning, for truth, for accountability, for change." The crowd erupted into applause, not of celebration, but of gratitude. Months later, Officer Collins was dismissed from the force, and criminal charges followed. His fellow officers distanced themselves. Internal investigations uncovered more misconduct buried in years of silence. Meanwhile, Janelle Moore's name became more than a headline. She was invited to speak across the country, to veterans, to victims, to students, to lawmakers. Her story, once nearly erased by a lie, now lit a path for others. She didn't ask to be a symbol. She simply refused to be a shadow.